Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Tabuns. I'm the MPP for Toronto-Danforth. Thank you for joining us on our town hall on education this evening. I want to welcome everyone here. I think that those of you who are attending tonight know how high the stakes are, know that the province's approach to funding public education has been pretty bad. What we're looking at this year promises some severe disruption with the Toronto District School Board. So I'm going to start off with the land acknowledgement, and then we'll proceed with the rest of the meeting. We acknowledge we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit people. And I want to add that I think a land acknowledgement is a good thing, but I think concrete action towards reconciliation is badly needed in this country, badly needed in this province and city. The purpose of this meeting is to fill people in on the background and context of the cutbacks that we're seeing. I want to hear about the proposed cutbacks to the front line, to hear from public, parents, teachers, and students, to discuss ways that we can all get involved and work together to push back. Tonight, you'll have an opportunity to hear from panelists who are very engaged with these issues, and you'll have time to express your concerns and your questions. To put questions, to make comments, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We won't be using the raised hand feature or chat. So our agenda is pretty simple. I'll be introducing our panelists. They will have up to 10 minutes each to speak. We'll have questions and commentary by you, the participants. I'll be taking those questions that you post, putting them to our panelists, raising some of the comments you've made. And at the end, last 5 minutes, we'll have closing comments and information. I'm very pleased to have the two panelists we have here this evening. The first, my colleague MPP Chandra Pasma, was elected to the legislature in June of 2022 for the riding of Ottawa West Nepean. She's a proven advocate for workers and people who need a helping hand, serves as the official opposition critic for education. Before being elected, Chandra was a researcher with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, fighting to ensure that all Ontarians have access to high quality, vital public services like healthcare, emergency services, and post-secondary education. I'm also pleased to have as a panelist Sara Ehrhardt, who was elected as TDSB trustee for Ward 15, that's here in Toronto-Danforth, in October of 2022. Sara has extensive firsthand insight in community organizing and advocacy work, with experience sitting on her child's school advisory council, working on the successful Save S.H. Armstrong Community Center pool campaign, which is where I first met Sara, and as a co-founder of Toronto Eastenders for Childcare, where she helped save city and school childcare centers from cuts. So she's had a long history fighting cuts. And now we'll go to our panelists' comments. Chandra, we'll start off with you.
Thanks so much, Peter, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you tonight from the unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe in Ottawa. Since I'm newly elected, most of my time as an NDP MPP has been with Peter as our interim leader, and so Peter is someone whose wisdom and expertise I've really benefited from as I've been finding my feet. I know you have a really great constituency MPP, and I would be well served if I can follow in Peter's footsteps up here in Ottawa. So thank you, Peter, for that. And this is such an important topic that we're discussing tonight. So I'm really grateful to Peter for pulling together this conversation, because our kids have really borne the brunt of the past 3 years. Our schools in Ontario were closed the most amount of time out of any jurisdiction in North America. And it was really because the government didn't want to make the investments that would keep schools open safely. Smaller class sizes, providing rapid tests to our publicly funded schools. They were happy to send them to the private schools. You know, they sent checks to parents instead of providing supports to kids. And so what we see is that after 3 years of this kind of disruption, our kids are really struggling. They're all over the map academically. I met with a teacher today who said, you know, in one class, you've got kids who are 4 to 5 grade levels apart in terms of their learning ability. And because they have such large class sizes, it's incredibly difficult for kids to be receiving the kind of support and guidance of the teacher for where they're at. Teachers have to provide such a wide range of support. They're also trying to keep kids safe in what can be an incredibly chaotic environment with so many children, including many children with disabilities and accessibility needs, kids with mental health challenges, kids who are acting out because they're not getting the support they need. And what I've seen and heard from parents in my riding of Ottawa West Nepean is even just classes that are too crowded for the number of kids they have. You know, there's one class that has 35 students, but they don't even have room for 35 desks. So the kids are all elbow to elbow at tables just to fit them into the classroom. It's not good for the kids. It's not great teaching conditions for the teachers. We know that kids' mental health is really struggling. You know, there was a recent survey that said nearly 60% of kids are depressed about the future. 91% of principals who were surveyed said their school needs more mental health resources. And we know that half of schools in Ontario have no mental health resources at all. Only 1 in 10 has regularly scheduled access to a mental health professional. And parents are just desperate for help. You know, the lucky ones have private benefits, but it's really difficult even to find private support right now because the demand for support is so high. What we really need to see is mental health resources in schools that are identifying problems early, that are providing group supports to kids so that we can really make sure that we are providing our kids with the support that they need. We're also seeing kids with disabilities and accessibility needs not getting the support that they need. So there's not enough EAs to support every child who needs one. There's far too many EAs who are being divided between 5 or 6 kids who all have equally legitimate and equally urgent needs, but the one EA can't respond to them all. Many occasions where the EA is being pulled off to do other duties, or there's no EA to replace someone when they're sick. And so kids are told you can't come into school today, there's no one to support you, or parents are getting a phone call, please come and pick up your child, we can't provide them the support that they need today. You know, it's really, we are not providing every child with the high quality education that they have a right to because we don't have those kinds of supports. We're also seeing shortages in other areas, not enough ECEs to support our youngest learners, not enough custodians to keep schools safe and clean, not enough child and youth workers and psychologists to support our children. And the inevitable outcome is that kids are falling through the cracks. They're not getting the supports they need. Parents are left on their own to try to navigate. You know, the government, instead of investing in supports in classrooms, sent checks to parents, which will provide 1 or 2 hours of tutoring or mental health supports if the parent can track those resources down. And not every parent has the resources to be able to do that, depending on where you live, you know, what your language is, because it's much harder to find these resources in French. These supports are not available. What we needed to do was work on procuring them collectively and making sure that kids could get them in the classroom. But, you know, this is a dire situation, but it's the result of deliberate policy choices by the Conservative government. So it's not just, you know, the pandemic happened, it was a terrible situation, nobody could have done anything about it. The Conservatives have been deliberately underfunding education for their entire time in office. And that's not to say that it was great under the Liberals before. You know, in 2018, when the Liberals lost power, we already had crowded classrooms, we had crumbling schools, we weren't funding special education well. But from that level of funding that was provided by the Liberals, the Conservatives have not even kept up with inflation since then. So schools are getting more than $800 less per child now than they were under the Liberals. If the funding had just kept pace with inflation, there would be $2.5 billion more for education funding this year alone. And the Financial Accountability Officer said that over the next 6 years, there's a gap of $6 billion in funding just to maintain the system that we have right now. And the Conservatives are not even getting the funding that they committed out the door. We know that this year alone, there's $430 million that they promised to spend that hasn't been spent. So they are significantly underinvesting in education. They also left our school boards to pay COVID-related expenses out of pocket. So they required these expenses to be put in place, which were legitimate, but they left it up to school boards to pay some of those expenses. We know that last year school boards paid 50% of COVID-related expenses. And so for the Toronto District School Board, and I think Sara will talk more about this, they paid $70 million out of their own reserves, and now they have a $64 million deficit, but they would be able to cover that deficit if they still had reserves. And the TDSB isn't the only one. We know other school boards are in that same position. Despite the mental health challenges that we're seeing, the Conservatives are providing less than a quarter per day per child in total mental health funding, when our kids have never been in a bigger mental health crisis. And the minister likes to obfuscate about all of this by talking about really big numbers and using the word historic a lot. I think there's never a question that I ask him that he doesn't use the word historic to in his response. But the reality is that our kids are they're not getting the support that they need now. And thanks to the government's underfunding and their refusal to reimburse the COVID-related expenses of school boards, our kids are going to get even less support next year. They are going to have to cut supports to our children because of this funding situation. And Sarah's going to talk more about the specific impact on the TDSB and what that will look like on the ground. But, you know, across the province, what we're going to see is teachers and education worker positions being cut. We're going to see fewer EAs, even though we already don't have enough, fewer ECEs, fewer safety monitors, fewer child and youth workers, despite the fact that we already have a rising violence problem and a mental health crisis. We're going to see the burnout rate among our teachers and education workers and principals increasing. There's already a very high rate of sick leave among our workforce. They're being asked to do more constantly in more challenging conditions without the resources and support that they need. And they're getting disrespected by the government while they're doing it. They're being attacked by the government. The government's dragging their feet on collective bargaining. And really what it looks like is that what the government is trying to do is to do the same thing to education that they've already done to healthcare, just to drive out the workforce, to erode the level of service, to cut the level of funding until privatization starts to look like the solution. And it's our kids that pay the price. With privatized education, just like with privatized healthcare, some lucky people will get quality service, but the rest of us will experience an erosion of service and an erosion of education. Now, I only have a minute left to talk about the fight back, but I do want to reassure you that there are solutions and that it is possible to fight back against the Conservatives. And what we saw with the CUPE education workers and Bill 28, when the government tried to legislate away the rights of very low paid education workers, is that solidarity works in fighting back against the Conservatives. We can make them back down for these decisions, but we need to stand together. We need parents standing with teachers and education workers, standing with trustees and other allies to together demand that the government invest in education, that they provide the supports and resources that our children need, that they pay workers the respect and provide them the decent working conditions that they deserve, that they reimburse school boards for their COVID-related expenses, and that at the end of the day, they make sure that every child in Ontario gets the support that they need. And there's a few things that you can do to help support that. Number one is to be aware, not fall for the government's hype, not fall for Stephen Lecce's use of the word historic, but to be aware of the cuts that they're making and the impact that will have those conversations with your fellow parents, with your friends, with your family, and then let the government know that you want to see adequate funding. So sign a petition, call or write Doug Ford and Stephen Lecce, and copy Peter so that he can amplify your voices on the legislature and that, and then publicly stand in solidarity. So attend rallies and protests, send a note of encouragement to your children's teachers and education workers, because it's really important for them to know too that you have their backs. But it's together standing in solidarity that will be able to make Doug Ford and Stephen Lecce back down on this.
Chandra, thank you very much for that. Before we go to Sara, I just want to note to everyone, again, if you have questions or comments, please post them in the Q&A. I also want to say that you can get closed captioning of what's being said. At the bottom of your screen where it says more, you'll see, when you click on more, you'll see captioning. Hit captioning and it's an ongoing transcription of what's being spoken on the screen. And with that, Chandra, thank you very much. I'll go to Sara. Sara.
Hi, thanks very much, Peter, Chandra, and PP Pasma. I'm honored to be here with both of you. This is my first time participating as a speaker in one of Peter's virtual town halls. And so I'm pretty honored. I've been a participant for many years. I'm honored to be elected to serve this community and to be able to participate in this capacity. I'll admit it's a bit emotional though, because I'm seeing the names of the attendees, and what I'm seeing are parents and activists that are fighting every day for their kids, their school, and that are willing to work together to fight for our broader community and all of our schools. And so forgive me if I get a bit emotional. I see the names of people that are writing me every day about specific situations that affect their child and other children. And all of you approach me with such care to fight not just for your child, but for a system that needs you right now more than ever. And so I just thank you for participating. I know many of you are going to have bedtime too. So I'm going to speak a bit about some of the items that Peter proposed that I bring up. And they're grim. They're grim, and they really echo what Chandra said for the province. And I would say that the TDSB, having been the epicenter of the pandemic for the province of Ontario, they're particularly grim numbers because we had a historic it's a historic crisis that took place here and that we are grappling with within the educational system and within our city and our community. And so what we're seeing right now, I think effectively is the province starving us out. We're waiting for and many that are here are aware of this. And as the MPP Pasma mentioned, we spent, as the Toronto District School Board and other school boards were required to spend reserves during the pandemic, rather than the province using other provincial funding to give to boards. They said, dip into your reserves. And the TDSB voted year one to use half its reserves. We didn't know how long the pandemic would go on. I was not a trustee then. The decision was made to use half the reserves. What that meant was not everything that could be done. Not every class size could be reduced to keep all kids as safe as we knew needed to happen. However, half the reserves were used. The next year, the other half of the reserves were used. We are now at the point where there are no reserves left. There's nothing left to pull from to maintain the funding levels. And so that is a problem. And so that is a $70 million figure, because you're going to hear lots of numbers. That's a $70 million figure. The province did provide $30 million in pandemic recovery, and they kept that going for a few years. And at the TDSB, we used that to put staff directly in schools to keep class sizes down and to support efforts in schools. And frankly, that's where they needed to go because the province had cut funding already. So it was gapping and it was plugging holes that already existed because of funding cuts. And so that money, they have said, is ending. That was always short-term money, but it was being used for things that are ongoing needs in our schools. Those are safe and caring adults in our schools in a variety of positions. Those are the vice principals, those are caretakers, those are lunch monitors, those are library teachers. And so all that funding was for nearly 500 positions, including, because I've heard this said, it does include some TDSB central staff, about 30, just not as many because there aren't as many, because it's a very big, we have almost 600 schools and only one central area. So it's just not as many numerically, but it's nearly 500 positions. So that is something that we're hearing a lot about now. That's 30 million in pandemic recovery. And then MPP Pasma also mentioned all of these costs that aren't being covered. There are so many of them. As I've become a trustee and I learn about all the things that the TDSB has been funding for, in some cases, decades, that are not being provided directly by the province, but which immediately and very directly impact the health and well-being of our kids, I'm shocked. I'm shocked every day about it. The ones right now to get us back to where we were before the pandemic is 50 million of cost increases, 50, 60 million. So that's $150 million that the Toronto District School Board is saying that it needs to keep going how it's currently going. That's how it's currently going. And so that is, for all the participants here, you know what the current situation is. This is to keep the current situation going. And that's where we're faced. That's about 5% of our budget that represents. The TDSB's budget is about 3.4 billion. These are big numbers because it's a big school board, right? So it is going to be necessarily a big number, but we're asking for about 5% more. That does not keep up with the cost of inflation. And as MPP Pasma said, they have unspent education funds. And so they are actually just sitting on money that they are not dispersing for the benefit of the province's children. Peter has called it cruel, and I agree. It is cruel, and I believe it's unconscionable. So that's the situation. And the money, so for next year's budget, they've told us they're not continuing that 30 million. They say they're not going to do the 70 million for depleted reserves because not all school boards depleted their reserves. The 50 million is all the schools across the province for the cost increases that impacts everybody. We'll see what they do. All of this is in a swirl of that they haven't released school board specific monies, what they call the grants for student needs, like all the money that they're going to provide school boards for us to set our budget. We are required by the Education Act to pass our budgets by the end of June. So when I say they're starving us out, I mean they're starving us out. They could have released that in January, in February, and March. Hopefully they'll be releasing it tomorrow. Every week we're waiting, all school boards are waiting for them to tell us how much money they think they'll give us next year. And the reason it's more acute this year is because we have no reserves to dip into. So that is why schools in Toronto-Danforth area in particular are hearing about cuts, because we're in an area, because we don't there's no money for the TDSB to use to backstop, to say, oh, we'll dip in a little here to make up if the province doesn't give us enough money. We have nothing we can dip into. So it's that is bad. And when I say we need 150 million to keep current service levels going, and we all know that current service levels are not enough. I know that at least half of the participants tonight can speak directly and individually to their child's experience and say that it is not enough. And so that's, I mean, it's maddening. It's deeply upsetting. And reference was made to mental health. I believe what is most cruel about the budget is that there was no funding for mental health, not for schools, not in hospitals. There's nowhere. And it is unconscionable what this government is knowingly doing to all of our children. Now, we know, so I'm saying what this means for students. We know what it means for families. We're all so tired, but still we're showing up. We're showing up to these meetings. We're going to show up for a rally for public education. We're going to call the premier. His number, just in case, is 416-325-1941. I know everyone has been doing the calls throughout the pandemic. We're going to pick up the phone and call him again. I want to speak to what it means for education workers. And this, I knew before I became a trustee that education workers work very hard. But I want to say that since I've become a trustee, I've been touring schools. I've been walking through our schools by day. I talk with the executive superintendent, the superintendents every day. I see the people being pulled in out of retirement to provide leadership in our schools. I talk about our schools being in crisis, but I also see these people going above and beyond every day to do the best that they can for our kids. Public education is still where our kids need to be. It's where our kids learn to be with each other through these problems. It is where we have to keep fighting. We have to keep fighting for these workers to be able to show up every day and be properly resourced for our kids. This, to me, I speak very heartfelt because these cuts will affect my family personally, as well as being your trustee overseeing these cuts, which is a heartbreaking thing to be doing, and I'm so sorry. But I really want to make sure we don't turn against the teachers, the principals, the VPs, the superintendents. They're showing up every day in this context, which they know better than ever. Some days when I'm getting the emails from you, they're getting the notices that they could be surplused, right? Which means they won't be able to be at the school in a future year. These are scary times for them, and they're still showing up every day to be present with our children and create the best environment that they can in the circumstances for them. And I'm immensely grateful to all of them, and would encourage a lot of kindness and collaboration as we continue to advocate for the best that we can for our kids and for all kids in the system. And so that's what I believe it means for the workers, and what it means of us as people that are navigating all of this. I know it's a lot, and what do we do but fight back? It's what we got to do. It's our kids, it's our community. We have to do it. I believe we have to start doing it in greater numbers, with renewed energy, and in some different ways. I think if they're just hearing from Toronto-Danforth, it's not going to be enough. And so we have to connect in across the province. And that's why I think it's so wonderful that we have MPP Pasma here, that we have Peter committed to making those linkages. I think it's important that we don't go region by region in the city or school by school in our community, that we keep very, very focused on the province, because they try to break us apart. They try to say historic 3 billion. They try to say, oh, it's the TDSB mismanaging, but we have to keep on them. And when we keep on them, we get results. This is a government that changes course on the regular. It's created chaotic, just complete chaotic about faces in our lives. And so I do believe that because we are in the right here, our kids need these resources to be supported. I believe this is a fight worth fighting for, and it's a fight that we can win. And just thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about it today.
Okay, Sara, thank you very much. Man, there's a lot of ground to cover, folks. We've got a number of questions and comments. Again, I invite people to post their questions and comments using the Q&A function. Reminder again that you can get captioning, so you can read what's being said if you have any hearing difficulties. I'm going to start going through some of the comments and questions. The first here is a comment. I've looked at the TDSB website. There's a chart showing last year's funding gaps that shows literally millions of dollars of funding gaps between the amounts the TDSB must spend to comply with contracts and mandates. The funding formula harms our children by requiring spending, but not paying for it. The total gap last year was nearly $300 million. What is the NDP strategy to hold the current government to fiscal account? Chandra, I'll start off with you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for this comment, because it's absolutely right. There are all kinds of things that school boards are required to spend on, in addition to things that are important to spend on, whether or not they're required by the province to spend on, that are just not funded by the province. And special education is a perfect example where children with accessibility needs or disabilities have a constitutional right to a high quality education. And yet the province funds special education based on a statistical model that has nothing to do with the actual needs of children in schools. And that's one reason why we're seeing so many kids with disabilities or accessibility needs not getting the supports that they need right now. And what's really frustrating too is that when parents try to hold school boards or the government accountable for that, courts rule it's only to the point of undue hardship, and if the funds aren't there, then it constitutes undue hardship. So what we really need to see is the government to step forward with the funding that is actually based on needs and would actually provide the supports to the level that are needed. We see the same with the funding formula, that it's incredibly outdated and doesn't work for students. And so it's not just a question of put more money on the table, but we need to think differently about how that money is being provided and ensure that the funding is being provided to actually provide every kid the supports that they need in the classroom, in school. And, you know, that's a fight that we are waging on a daily and weekly basis in the legislature, including we had a motion calling on the government to increase funding to reimburse those COVID-related expenses. We are calling on the government regularly in question period debates on the budget, you know, demanding that level of funding, and that we are actually providing funding to the level of our children's needs and not some arbitrary formula.
Thank you, Chandra. The next question. The issue is that A, all the parents are being kept in silos and not being told that this is happening in other schools. So we haven't known the size of the issue. And B, how do we do something to change this other than voting in the next election? Sara, you were touching on that. Do you want to expand, respond to this and expand on what we can actually do to put pressure on this government to move?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Jill. I think parents being kept in silos, I think it's that's what we're trying to do here, is bring people together. And I do think that politically, that's the place where we come together on that issue. I think that's my role as your trustee, to help bring that together. I don't think that's as much of a role for teachers, for superintendents, for principals, but it's our role as politicians to work with you and community and to work with allied organizations, right? And so here in the East End, we have East End Parents for Public Education. That is one avenue that we can organize through that already exists. And they and some parents are organizing an East End rally for public education Saturday, April 15th. I'm just reading the notes, at 11 a.m. at the Robertson Parquet. I always call it the Coxwell Parquet because it's the southwest corner of Coxwell and Danforth. It's in Toronto-Danforth, but it's right near Coxwell Station. And so we're inviting parents from across the East End to come, so that we can share stories, that we can talk with each other, so that we can talk about what next steps we want to take as a community. And we're inviting people from all over to come. We're hoping we can continue to link up to build over time, because I do believe we're going to need to be building over the next few months to really get the attention of this government beyond the lip service they're paying right now of, oh, we're giving the TDSB $3 billion, that's enough, or oh, this historic, as MPP Pasma said. They will listen when they hear us loudly, and we need to keep building. And we in Toronto-Danforth, we're right in there early, and so we got to get in there early to get the rest of the city going with us. Yeah, so that would be my biggest encouragement right now. And you can bring family. It's a family-friendly event. We'll have some materials there to make signs. You can bring your own signs, and we'll start brainstorming the next actions we want to take. But Peter, is that helpful?
Yeah, no, I think it is. And we'll see what other questions come up on this. Next question I have is, please address the money needed to support kids who are backlogged awaiting support for those who are diagnosed or not with autism. Came up at the CBC noon hour call-in today on this issue. This is going to be an increasingly problematic issue. Chandra, if you could speak to that, because I know it was starting to come up in the legislature last week.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. And there's actually two separate issues that are happening because of the damage that the Conservative caused with the Ontario Autism Program. So the first is that there was a small number of children who started receiving support under the Liberal government, who maintained that level of support throughout the 5 years of the Conservative government. That's often referred to as the Autism Legacy Program. And so these were kids who actually were fully funded for therapy. Many of them were receiving full-time therapy, and so have not been in our schools. And what has just happened is that the government has abruptly transitioned that program, capped their funding the same way funding for all other children with autism is capped. And so many of these kids are going from full day therapy every day to, a day of therapy or less than a day of therapy. And so some of these children who have never been in our schools before are being enrolled in our schools now, beginning April 1st and, through September as the Autism Legacy funding ends. But the government never informed school boards that these children will be coming, and they provided no additional resources to support these kids. Many of these kids have very high needs, and it's not only for educational support, but in many cases for protection. So they may be flight risk, or they may be at risk of putting things in their mouths that they shouldn't, and choking. So they really need to be watched. They need to have EAs, or they need to be in congregate classes for children with disabilities. But as I've mentioned several times already, we don't have enough resources to support the kids with disabilities in our schools now. And we are adding over the next couple months up to 4,000 more children with disabilities with no additional resources. So we are setting those kids up to fail, and we are creating a safety risk for other children and for teachers and education workers in the classroom by doing this with no transition plan, no resources, no support whatsoever. The second issue is that because the government killed the Ontario Autism Program 5 years ago, there's a whole generation of kids with autism who have grown up without therapy, who have therefore been in our schools without the kinds of resources and supports that would actually allow them to integrate and succeed in our schools. And so what I hear from many teachers and education workers and parents is that some of the challenges related to violence or to mental health challenges in the classroom are related to that fact that kids aren't getting the support they need that would actually allow them to successfully attend school. And so, it's not as if every child with autism is aggressive or violent, but when you're taking kids and not providing them the support that they need, putting them in incredibly frustrating situations, some of them will act out with aggression and will put teachers and education workers and other kids at risk. And so we have set up that group of kids to fail as well, as well as setting up a situation for chaos in our classrooms. So the government has really failed all of our kids with autism by refusing to actually invest in the therapies and the supports and services that they need.
Chandra, thank you very much. Just a reminder that if you have a question or comment, please put it into the Q&A. The next question is one that I'd like both of you to address. And I've noticed this as I've been canvassing this week, that I've come across teachers who are just now getting briefed on what's going to be happening in their schools, and they're reeling. But parents, I don't think are aware of what's coming. I want to say to all of you attending this evening, this is an early informational attempt. This can't be the end of it. I think a lot of parents are going to be shocked when they realize what's happening in their schools. So, question, is there an opportunity to reach parents who aren't aware for whatever reasons? Parents have a lot on the go right now, back in office, overwhelmed with rising living costs. How can we connect with them to raise this? Many parents aren't aware this is an issue, as far as I understand, from playground conversations. Sara, if you wouldn't mind commenting first, and Chandra, I'll go to you.
Thank you. And I would agree that parents are aware there are problems, but parents are tired. We're tired. We have fought through so much to parent during a pandemic, and we know in our hearts that what's going on isn't right, but we are keeping things going. We're doing our elder care. We're doing our extended family care. We're holding down our jobs. We're getting our kids to school in the morning, and we're lining up all the supports we can to try to give our kids as much as we can in the context of what has been lost over the past 2 years. Our kids don't, I know everybody's tired. And so I do think that for some, they're saturated. They're saturated. We don't have another fight in us. But I think with time, that is also going to change. And so I would invite everybody here to engage in active conversations on the playgrounds. So I can say some of the things I'm doing, but I need to be very honest, between now and June, we need everybody on this call getting involved in these conversations, because I won't be able to have enough conversations to make it happen. And Peter, even though I know he's knocking on doors every day, I don't think he's gonna make, we need everybody here telling these stories, because I know Peter's out there talking to everyone every day too. But many of the schools have morning coffee morning with parents. That's a great time to mention what's going on during the monthly coffee mornings. I have gone to one or two, and there have been tears about what's going on in some of the schools in our community and the projected cuts. I've held an emergency ward council meeting and invited all ward councils to provide information during their this month's tranche of council meetings on what's happening and encouraging action. And I am starting to see that take shape, and that I'm seeing more and more emails come from different school communities. So when you are sending letters, I would encourage you to keep me on the CC, Sara.Ehrhardt@tdsb.ca. I'd also encourage you to keep Peter on, and say what school you're at. Say you're from this community. It's okay, just so that we know that the word is getting out. But I am seeing it get out that way. But I will say that I'm noticing that it's hard to break through because we're tired. But one parent put it recently on one of our Facebook groups: we're all tired, but it's our kids. So we all just have to get started again. And we know it's a fight we can win too. And we know it's the fight we have to win because it's our kids.
Thank you. Chandra, if you would comment on that.
I absolutely agree with Sara. I know that people are tired. People were burnt out and tired from the pandemic already before, we saw these crises arrive. There's the healthcare crisis that people are trying to navigate. There's the incredible rise in the cost of living that is overwhelming people. It feels like you're fighting on many different fronts with not a lot in the gas tank. I certainly appreciate that. And I know that, part of the answer is that politicians like Sara and Peter and I need to use the platforms that we have and the megaphones that affords us to keep communicating and keep making sure that as many people as possible hear from us about the danger of these cuts. But what we also saw with the CUPE education workers and their very successful organizing that led to Doug Ford backing down was the power of conversations between ordinary people. So that CUPE education strike did not happen overnight. That was months of conversation within CUPE about the challenges that CUPE education workers were experiencing on their job, the challenges with the very low pay, and what they were going to do about it together. And we can see, the kind of solidarity that resulted from that. And so the conversations that you have on a day-to-day basis with other parents on the playground, in your social circle, with family members and friends, and they don't have to be, 15-minute rants in which you deliver all kinds of information. It can be really short and heartfelt about the impact of what you're seeing on your own kids. Those conversations absolutely make a big difference. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that while all the crises that we're facing can be incredibly demoralizing and draining, solidarity is actually really energizing. So when we come together and we fight back together, that actually brings joy and energy, and solidarity just grows from there. So, take heart that in the fight, you can actually find the energy to keep going and to continue that fight.
Thank you both. Next, action question. If we're sending letters, calling, etc., what's the messaging we should focus on? What do you think has the most effect? Sara, I'll go back to you first and then on to you, Chandra.
So I'll be interested what Chandra has to say as well on this. I think what is heartfelt is most impactful. I think what is heard personally, I think what is heard the most is not, I'm getting the same form email again and again. Though if that's what we've got time to do, that's what we've got time to do, because just even clicking a form email is better than nothing. Like, we do what we can when we can. However, when it's heartfelt and when it speaks to your experience, I believe politicians, right-wing politicians, conservative politicians, will start to see this is hitting home. This is hitting this is hitting voters. This is hitting people and with lived experience. These aren't talking points that are being provided to people. These are people's heartfelt lived experiences of their day-to-day that they're conveying. And I think that is always the best thing that can be done, which is why for the past few years, every time I felt tired, I picked up the phone and I called 416-325-1941. That it is always staffed. There's always someone taking notes when I can say, when I'm upset that the premier was not putting the resources in place to keep class sizes low, when I was concerned around my child re-entering school during the pandemic. And I do believe now is the time to call. I hope over time we'll offer some other phone numbers to call as well. I think we have to share the love a little, but I think when in doubt, a phone call to 416-325-1941 is always a great option.
Thank you. Chandra.
Yeah, I think sharing your personal story is a really powerful political tool, whether you're speaking to friends and neighbors or you're speaking to Doug Ford or Stephen Lecce. Stephen Lecce especially likes to hide in numbers and statistics, and he makes some very creative use of statistics. But what doesn't lie is the situation on the ground, and the outcomes that you are experiencing, what your kids are experiencing in school, is a result of his policy choices. And I think it's incredibly important, as you call for more funding, as you call for more resources, to keep saying to Doug Ford and Stephen Lecce, this is the outcome of the choices you are making. You need to make different choices to support kids and families like mine.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to this one. Sara, you may be able to speak to this, particularly with regards to the TDSB in greater detail than Chandra. Specifically, how many approximate teachers are we looking at losing per public school?
So teachers offhand, my answer is, I don't know. We're looking at nearly 500 positions. To date, we did preliminary staffing allocations where there were some reductions that were approved for elementary and secondary teachers. However, that we are still waiting for the big pot of money called the Grants for Student Needs that would help us better know what is really possible. And so when we receive that, that's when the conversations are going to start. I will say that there are some places where the board has obligations, there it has to meet staffing requirements, and teachers is one of them for some grades, not all grades. And so people are already hearing what potential class sizes could be with what we're calling preliminary staffing allocation. That's based on the projection of how many kids will be in the building and in what grade levels, the projected needs-based prioritization of the school that's based on citywide considerations of equity and what we have available. And so when we get more information from the province, who is starving us out, who is forcing us to articulate what the very bare minimum is for us, because once we've articulated it, then they know, then they know that they can just keep going. I feel it's very deliberate what they're doing by being late to release these fundings. So once we have that, we can know if there's any more money to put back in. However, if there isn't, then we have to start to look at other areas if we want to put teachers back into the system. So we have to look at what other things we offer. So as a school board, and that is where the very terrible discussions around cuts may have to take place. And this is where I get emotional, because I fought for school pools. That's how I met Peter. These are the kind of things that are on the table to make sure that we still have other staff in the buildings. And so it is a terrible discussion that we are on the verge of taking place at a school board. And every week that they delay the Grants for Student Needs is a week that we have less time to engage the public on this issue, which is why I believe they're starving us out and shrinking the window for us to engage parents families, our constituents around these issues. And I'm sorry, because that was probably a little bit off, but that's why I don't have a straightforward answer for teachers, and I do apologize.
Yeah, I'd just like to add myself, again, when I was out canvassing, talking to an elementary school teacher who's going to be having a class of 36 next September. And in her school, in the briefing they were given, an indication that they were going to lose a few teachers, which is why her class size was ballooning. And she said, I don't know what you do with 36 kids. You know, that is not manageable in that grade 5, grade 6 range. It just is not. So I think I'll just add what Sarah's saying. This delay in getting the numbers out strengthens the hand of the province to make it too late to mobilize people. I have an action question here. Do you have any recommendations or plans to inform and engage community members who are not parents of school-aged children, but value and support public schools and are concerned about the Ford government decimating education? Chandra, I'll start with you. I'll just say, folks, we're coming close to the end, so if you can be relatively brief, that would be great.
Yeah, and I think this comes down to the solidarity again, and what I saw with the CUPE education strike in the fall. So as a parent, when unions were on strike in 2019 and 2020, I was out on the picket lines with teachers and education workers. And there was a pretty mixed reaction from the public to those strikes. You know, there were as many supportive honks as there were rude gestures. But in the fall, when the CUPE education workers were out and there was a protest line at my office, what was really striking as I walked the lines with them was how everybody was in support. Like, it was all demographics. It was parents of young kids, but it was also seniors with no kids. It was workers of all types. We really saw the public come together and rally behind these workers. And that's one of the things that made the difference. We need to see that same kind of rallying now. And we need to see, you know, healthcare workers standing in solidarity with education workers, and education workers standing in solidarity with healthcare workers, because what the government is trying to do to these systems is the same thing. So we need to really get the message out about how the Ford government is attacking these programs and services that are so important to our society, so important to the well-being of the members of our community, and in the case of schools and education, the youngest and most vulnerable members of our community.
Sara, did you want to address that as well?
Yeah, I just say thank you, because I couldn't agree more. I think making the links is very important. I would say when I've been out knocking on doors, I feel like everyone has wanted to talk about education. They may preface it saying, I don't have a child in the education system, or my children have grown up, but everyone in Toronto-Danforth that I've spoken to at the door has had something to say about education. They care. And at this moment in time, I think making the links is more powerful than ever, because schools, I've seen that there's been lots of questions about air quality and public health guidelines in schools. Schools are an essential component of our broader healthcare system. Addressing mental health issues is both a medical issue and education issue. It's completely intertwined. There are many other places, and the workers in our schools, the attendance issues in our schools, these are all related to the general situations happening in all workforces, where each of us is a caregiver in some capacity to people that are dealing with the impacts of surgical backlogs, where each of us is dealing with an impact that relates to a child that has not been able to access the education they need through the public system. So I believe that we in our day-to-day lives know these linkages, and it's okay for us to bring that all together when we advocate to this government who is seeking to tear us apart.
So with that, we're down to our last 4 minutes. If I could have wrap-up comments from both of you, about a minute and a half. Chandra, I'll go to you first. I just have a few things to say at the end.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for hosting this conversation, and to everyone who attended. I think it's given you a sense of how urgent this fight is, but also hopefully we have inspired you that it is not a hopeless fight. The solutions are there. A positive outcome is possible. What we need to do is stand in solidarity and work together. to achieve that outcome. And I hope you feel inspired and motivated to get involved in that fight. And one good thing that you can do that will help you to stay on top of what is happening is to follow me, to follow Sara, to follow Peter on social media, because we'll keep you updated as more information comes out, both about the funding model and the impact on kids, but also about actions that you can get involved in to be part of the fight.
Thank you. Sara.
Yeah, all of that, I think I just echo like an appreciation for everyone that's joined, for everyone that I know is continuing to fight for our schools and our kids. And just if you have ideas, I could see from the participants on this call, we have organizers on this call. So please feel free to organize, to talk with people, to get started and share it. Share with me what you're doing. Share with us what you're doing. We're united in our common beliefs here of fighting in support of public education. We can use many means of fighting for that, for advocating for that. And I just want to really encourage people to get started and have those conversations. And thank you for joining.
Okay, thank you both very much. I wanted to say to all of you who've attended this evening and stayed right through that we will be posting this town hall so that others can access it. Please let friends and family know about it so that they have an increase in awareness as to the problem and as to the things they can do to fight back against the Ford government. I want to remind you, as Sara has noted earlier, that there'll be an East End rally for public education Saturday, April 15th at 11 a.m. at the Robertson Park. That's the southwest corner of Coxwell and Danforth, conveniently located by the Coxwell subway station. So people in Toronto-Danforth and Beaches East York will find it very easy to get there, but people are welcome from across Toronto. So bring your family, bring your friends, and push back against these cuts. You can make signs before you arrive. I would suggest cuts hurt kids and fund public education, but there will also be supplies, markers, and cardboard there for you to make your own, to bring out the deep creativity in a population devoted to protecting their children. We'll be sending out a package from this evening to those who've signed up. We'll add you to our distribution lists. And I just want to thank you all, to the trustee, Sara Ehrhardt, to the critic, Chandra Pasma. You were really good tonight. I'm very appreciative. To my staff, Louise, Rob, Elaine, for doing all the behind the scenes work and getting this rolling in the first place. I'm very, very grateful. All of you who are here tonight, thanks for taking an interest in our children. Thanks for being prepared to push back politically so we actually can protect them. Have a good evening, everyone. Enjoy yourselves.